Thank you very much, John, for that kind introduction. Can I be heard in the back? I think this may be the first time that I've spoken to an overflow audience, and it's very gratifying. It's also the first time that I have spoken here at the British School over the course of more than 40 years spent on and off next door at the sister institution, so it's a particular honor. I received much assistance from many colleagues and friends here in Athens and elsewhere in the preparation of this paper, and I shall acknowledge them in the course of the lecture. Let me first say a word to the students from King's, who are the reason that we have come together this evening, on how this paper came about. When Michael Squire invited me to speak to you, and he told me that your course is primarily about the ancient Greek body as it developed in sculpture, I did not have a topic dealing with sculpture ready to hand, but I had been thinking about two different aspects of Greek bodies that we see in two-dimensional representations, namely on figure-decorated vases. One striking aspect is that, in contrast to the constantly idealized nude male bodies of archaic and classical Greek sculpture, the vase painters were far ahead of their time in presenting quite clearly unidealized bodies as early as the middle of the 6th century. These bodies tend to appear in one of two specific contexts on black figure vases: boxers and sometimes wrestlers, who all seem to belong to the heavyweight category and sometimes look more like sumo wrestlers, and men taking part in a symposium, the all-male drinking party, or more often in the komast, the drunken revel that followed. The second aspect that intrigued me is the painter's fascination with what happens to these bodies under the influence of too much wine, in particular what comes out of them, not as a rule topics of polite conversation, but one that was as much a part of the Greek imagination as the exquisitely delicate vases on which these often very crude scenes were painted. A fine example of both aspects of the body is the vase you see here in Athens in the National Archaeological Museum, made about 530. And I want to thank Yorgos Kavadias and Maria Kiridoglu of the National Museum, as well as Michele Azzuni, a student at the American School, for the fine photos you'll see. The vase is signed both by the potter Xenocles and the painter Klesophos, and is known in the scholarship as the Klesophos Inokoi. They were clearly proud of this little piece, only 22 centimeters high, for they added a couple of extra flourishes, a pair of modeled snakes along the rim, and a kantharos in reserved clay at the base of the handle. 6 mature men with very full beards and curious headgear have become especially rowdy after too much to drink, even as a young servant continues to ladle out more wine from a big crater. The serving boy wears a short garment that indicates his low status, but all the partygoers are stark naked, the better to show off that several have a decided paunch and are well past the age of the fit young athlete. Are we to suppose that as the evening progressed, the participants took off all their clothes? Surely not, for it is well known that on Greek vases men do all sorts of things in the nude, that would be highly improbable in real life, such as going into battle. As the Etruscologist Larissa Bonfante famously wrote some 25 years ago, nudity is a costume in Greek art, one that can be put on for a variety of reasons and in a variety of contexts. Here, one function of the nudity, I think, is precisely to show off the aging body of the typical Athenian, and even worse, to make us confront some of the more unpleasant effects of excessive drink. Two men seem unable to stay upright, one propped on a cushion, the other bracing himself with his left hand to keep from sprawling onto the floor and spilling the wine in his fiale. One is still able to play the auloi, or double pipes, while another belts out a tune. As in other cultures, drinking songs were very popular among the Greeks, and several have come down to us. Finally, there is the bizarre pair at the right, engaged in something that used to be called horsing around. It looks to me like a demented version of ephedrysmos, a kind of piggyback ride that is usually seen in Greek art as a game played by demure young ladies or children. Perhaps this element of parody is part of the humor. Being hoisted up by his companion has caused the one man to let loose a torrent of something that is all too realistically rendered. A few scholars in the past tried to salvage some sense of propriety by assuming that the man is merely breaking wind, but, as we will see in other similar depictions, this is very unlikely. Now, a discussion of drunken men defecating in public might seem inappropriate to the genteel confines of the British school at Athens. But as the United States has recently entered an era of unprecedented, unapologetic vulgarity, it is perhaps fitting for an American to tackle a subject that until recently had attracted very little interest on the part of scholars of Greek vase painting. I should start by admitting that this is not the first time I have dealt with this type of iconography. In 2002, together with Beth Cohen, an independent scholar of Greek vases in New York, I published an article called The Use and Abuse of Attic Vases in the Festschrift for Dietrich von Bothmer, the longtime curator of Greek and Roman art in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the leading disciple of Sir John Beazley, his teacher at Oxford. In this paper, we explored a curious motif that we had both independently observed, pictures on vases of vases used as receptacles for things other than those for which they were intended, such as wine or water. Or, to put it more bluntly, men and occasionally women urinating, here, vomiting. This figure, who you see has actually put his fingers in his mouth to vomit, masturbating, or, yes, defecating into a vase. The clay sophos inakui would thus not qualify. There is no receptacle. But just 2 years earlier, a study of this and related scenes by Robert Sutton had aided our understanding of what the meaning of such coarse behavior might have been for the Athenian elite who used these vases. He sees the drunken orgy of archaic Athens as reflecting, quote, an ironic outlook that simultaneously deplores and celebrates tasteless behavior, end quote, an attitude best embodied in the figure of Hippocleides, who danced away his bride in the house of Cleisthenes of Sicyon. My return to the topic this year was the result of stumbling upon a truly remarkable vase on a visit to the Louvre. I show you here two of the amateur photos that I snapped on that occasion, with better ones to come. The vase is problematic for a number of reasons, and I could give a long list of colleagues who have generously shared their expertise with me, none more so than Maria Pipili, formerly Director of Research at the Academy of Athens. The vase was in a small vitrine in the Louvre, showcasing some recent acquisitions. In fact, I have subsequently learned that it was acquired in the very year of my visit, 2009, in the sale of the Bellon collection, but it has not yet been fully published. The shape is a kantharos, the favorite wine vessel of the god Dionysus. But the form of this kantharos is not the standard model made in Athens and elsewhere with high-swung handles. Rather, the sturdy strap-like handles rise only slightly above the rim. The addition of a creamy white slip, so-called white ground, to a black figure vase is also unusual in this period, roughly the middle of the 6th century or slightly later. For these and other reasons, most of the experts I consulted believe that it was made in a Laconian workshop, that is, in the area of ancient Sparta. One fairly good parallel for this shape and technique is the kantharos offered to Polyphemus on the famous Laconian cup, dated 570 to 60, showing the blinding of the Cyclops. And interestingly, the kantharos held by the young serving boy on the Attic Klesophos innocuity is also not so different in shape from the one in the Louvre. But for this evening, I want to stay away from problems of shape, date, and workshop, and instead focus on the scenes on the new vase and what they contribute to the growing body of evidence for the behavior of drunken komasts. The two sides of the vase offer what could be understood as two different stages in the komos as the evening progresses and the wine flows freely from a big volute crater near one handle. You'll see more of it later. On the obverse, 6 bearded komasts frolic in a variety of dance-like poses. I tentatively call this the obverse because the two figures partly disappearing under the handles belong to this side as they are turned to face the central group of 4. They all appear to be nude, though added red highlights their bottoms as well as their hair. The red on the rear ends of komasts is sometimes thought to represent a kind of padded leotard, hence the designation padded dancers. But that is surely not the case here. There are no attributes of any kind, no accoutrements of the symposium, apart from the crater, no indications of the space they occupy or filling ornament. The reverse side could not be more different. Here, the clearly inebriated komasts engage in a variety of antics, from the breathtakingly clever to the disgustingly uncouth. We may imagine that a few hours and a couple of craters of wine separate the moments shown on the two sides of the vase. Before looking at these in detail, first some background on scenes of komasts on archaic vases from different regions of Greece. The earliest komasts appear on Corinthian vases already in the late 7th century. We start to see them in Boeotia at about the end of the first quarter of the 6th century. In Boeotia, these dancing komasts are shown predominantly on kantharoi, and only occasionally on cups or skiphoi, the preferred shape everywhere else. A good example is this kantharos here in the collection of the British School, given by the great archaeologist Tom Dunbabin, and I thank Penny Wilson for the good photo on your left. Most of the komoi on Boeotian kantharoi include at least one musician, and you can see him on the left, an element that we saw on the Klesophos inokoi, but which is missing from the Louvre kantharos. In general, however, the crude behavior of drunken komasts is more prevalent in Boeotia than in other workshops, and my first reaction to the Louvre kantharos was to wonder if it could be Boeotian as well, an idea I have since given up. An early Boeotian komast kantharos in the Thebes Museum anticipates by a generation the notion of a progression from fairly tame frolicking on one side of the vase to drunken mayhem on the other. The obverse shows 4 dancing komasts in unremarkable poses, while the reverse is altogether different. One older man with a grizzled beard has very definitely had too much wine as he vomits while clutching his throbbing head. The man toward the center has a grotesquely enlarged phallus with red indicating the exposed head, and both of the other two have deformities of the feet. You can see here the club foot. More on crippled komasts later in this paper. On an astonishing miniature Boeotian kantharos, about contemporary in date with ours, this one in the Kanalopolis Museum here in Athens, a komast is in even more dire straits. I'm very grateful to Angelos Sarkadas, director of the museum, for his generous help. You see the vase in Dr. Sarkadas's capable hands. The komast in distress is comforted by a friend who reaches across the handle zone and lays a hand on his head. This poor soul is, in the words of the tactful French scholar who published the vase, I quote, apparently the victim of troubles that are both gastric and intestinal, end quote. Then there is the defecator on the kantharos in the Louvre, whose outburst does not seem to be the result of stomach upset or ill-advised horseplay. It seems instead rather casual, and he gestures toward the dancer under the handle, who has suddenly turned to look back, perhaps attracted by the sound or the smell. We have now seen the rather disconcerting motif of the defecating komast in 3 important workshops of the Archaic period, Boeotian, Laconian, and Attic. What were these artists thinking? Just as I was wondering this myself, a brand new book by a German colleague, Detlef Vanagat, came to my attention. Though the book is primarily a study of Corinthian komasts, the workshop that invented the subject and where it was most popular, it also includes a long chapter with the marvelously sober German title, I translate, On the Distribution of Fecal Motifs in the Archaic Period. Among other things, Vanagat shows that there is only a single depiction on a Laconian black figure vase. He was not yet aware of the Louvre kantharos. This crudely drawn cup, found in the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, and dated 580 to 70, thus the earliest known example of the subject. Through a careful analysis of the motif of defecating komasts, Vanagat arrives at a bold and ingenious hypothesis that distances the phenomenon from our modern offended sensibilities, or the notion of transgressive behavior favored by Sutton and others. It is not, he argues, an unfortunate accident or a version of gross-out humor that has become all too common in popular culture like movies. Rather, Vonnegut coins a term that can be roughly translated as festive defecation. He argues that in combination with other komastic behaviors and within the larger Dionysiac setting, defecation becomes an indication of the abundance, perhaps overabundance, of the food and drink on festive occasions like the symposium and komast. One piece of evidence he adduces is particularly interesting in our context. Satyrs, the bestial followers of Dionysus, engage in all the same excessive behaviors of the komasts. A Euboean black figure lekythos in Tampa depicts one of the earliest scenes of the vintaging of the grapes in the presence of the god Dionysus, if he is indeed the surprisingly modest figure at the right holding a large drinking horn. My thanks to Seth Pevnick, curator in Tampa, for this excellent photo. A big ecstatic Maenad occupies the center of the scene, holding a rather splendid kantharos in one hand and another horn in the other, while a satyr at the left treads the grapes. Seemingly perched on the Maenad's head is a second, smaller satyr who simultaneously plays the aulos, has an erect phallus, and defecates. For Vonnegut, a perfect trifecta embodying the pleasures of the wine in a Dionysian context. The presence of no fewer than 4 drinking vessels in the scene, the kantharos, 2 drinking horns, and the improbably large kylix catching the flow of wine, clearly alludes to the pleasures awaiting the consumer. We return to the kantharos in the Louvre to look more closely at the remarkable figure of the komast juggling 3 different vases. A kantharos that is not so different in shape from this vase. In one hand, an odd drinking vessel with globular body and handles sticking out in the other, and a deep bowl with offset rim, very small foot and short stem, balanced on the heel of his right foot. In our 2002 paper, Beth Cohen and I collected some examples of Attic komasts and satyrs performing acrobatic feats, like the satyr on Douris's famous Psychter in the British Museum, who balances a kantharos on his erect penis. Perhaps the closest parallel for the motif of a vase balanced on the upturned heel is a donkey's head rhyton in the Hermitage, with the young komast kicking his left leg high in the air with a skyphos of wine balanced on the heel. But the acrobat on our kantharos predates all these Athenian examples by a good half-century. His frontal face is a rarity on Greek vases, one that always carries the connotation of some kind of altered mental state, fear, horror, glee, or simply drunkenness. This, of course, begs the question, how drunk can you be and still execute such an impressive feat of agility? I have not had time to investigate in detail the shapes of the 3 vessels that our frontal-faced man juggles, but my hunch is that we may have a situation not unlike that on a small series of Attic red figure cups that have a frieze of vases running beneath a symposium scene. As Dufry Williams and others have observed, not all of the shapes in these friezes correspond to pots that were in actual use in the period. In other words, there is a certain amount of fantasy on the part of the painter in inventing clever and unknown shapes for the symposium, such as the skyphos with the phallus-shaped spout on this cup in London. But there is one pot depicted on our kantharos that I can explore with you in a bit more detail, the large volute crater set on what seems to be a kind of low table or tripod stand at the left of the group of cavorting komasts. François Lissarag has written compellingly of the central role of the crater as a kind of fellow participant in the symposium, often the immovable focus of attention amid a group permanently in motion. This is certainly true on the clay sophos inochoe, with which we began, with its big, probably bronze calyx crater at the exact center of the scene, engraved with a prancing horse. A psicter or wine cooler floats inside the crater, and the boy will use a kiathos to ladle the drink out of it and into a kantharos, a complicated process that shows how the consumption of wine could be turned into a kind of ritual act with religious overtones, since the wine was the gift of Dionysus. I wondered whether the typology of the volute crater and stand on our kantharos could tell us something more about this enigmatic vase. Jasper Gaunt pointed me to a spectacular bronze volute crater from the site of Trebeniște in Macedonia, now in Belgrade, as an interesting parallel. The peculiar tripod beneath the crater on our kantharos would represent the stand on which such metal craters stood, here elaborately decorated with hunting dogs and other motifs. The row of purple dots on the rim is also a reference to metal craters and has parallels in other workshops. I turn now to a third figure on this side of the kantharos, just beside the crater. He seems to be dancing, perhaps looking back past the crater toward the revelers on the other side of the vase. His body looks somewhat out of kilter to begin with, especially with the buttocks that seem to be in the wrong place. Compare the komast next to him. But even more striking are the feet that twist and curve upward in an unnatural pose. By comparison with many other depictions on komast vases, like this one from Corinth, we can say that this is not an attempt at some very complicated dance move, but rather that he has a deformity of the feet. The word cripple is the standard term for such figures in the scholarship, though that does not seem quite right, since crippled implies limited mobility, while these handicapped figures dance as vigorously as their fellow komasts, if not more so. But I shall continue to use it for want of a better word. How are we to understand the presence of a cripple alongside one companion of uncommon agility, another of rather uncouth behavior, and a fourth who has nothing unusual about him, except maybe the big pot belly, going back to the beginning of this talk? Though some would say that the ancients had a less enlightened attitude toward the disabled than we do, it would be wrong to label the cripple here as a figure of mockery. The prototype of all such figures, after all, is the lame god Hephaistos. And though he is presented as a figure of fun in the famous scene at the end of the first book of the Iliad, where he hobbles around the table of the gods, feasting on Mount Olympus, filling their cups of ambrosia, it is not a cruel joke, since he is able to laugh at himself and to appreciate the incongruity of the grizzled and lame god playing the role of the beautiful young Ganymede.
Athenian artists rarely allude to Hephaestus's lameness at all, and when they do, then only with the utmost discretion, as on the Francois vase, where you can just make out that the god's feet face in opposite directions. The Iliad does, however, present another figure whose deformity is not so sympathetically portrayed, of course, Thersites, the ugliest man who came beneath Ilion, as Homer calls him. He is the earliest and best example of the Greek idea that ugliness and physical deformity are the outward manifestations of an individual who is ethically and morally deficient. Here are a few verses from Book 2 in the translation of Richmond Lattimore. He was bandy-legged and went lame on one foot, with shoulders stooped and drawn together over his chest, and above this his skull went up to a point, with the wool grown sparsely upon it. Beyond all others, Achilles hated him, and Odysseus. The poet adds that within this misshapen head there were many words, but disorderly. That is, the deformity of his body matches that of his mind. Thersites is certainly a figure of mockery, especially when Odysseus clobbers him on the back of the neck, raising a big bloody welt between his shoulders, to the great merriment and applause of the Greek army. But our crippled komasts have neither the divine spark of Hephaestus, nor are they objects of opprobrium like Thersites. What is clear is that they are not shunned by their fellow revelers. On the contrary, they are well integrated into the gathering, and by the ostentatious display of their deformity, they call attention to it rather than trying to hide it, their exuberance no doubt fueled by the wine. They are special in the same sense as a juggler or a man who vomits or defecates. All fall outside the norms of proper citizen appearance and behavior, and they embody the excesses that mark the komos as a kind of out-of-body experience, what the Greeks considered a sort of possession or enthusiasmos, brought over them by the god of the wine Dionysus. With the end of the Archaic period, conventionally marked by the Persian Wars of 490 and 480, scenes of wild, drunken revelers went out of fashion, especially on vases in the new red figure technique that was invented in Athens probably in the years about 520. By now, the Athenian pottery industry had virtually driven all the competition, Corinthian, Boeotian, Laconian, out of the market, so our evidence for symposium and komos is largely limited to Athens from here on out. Of course, communal drinking never went out of fashion, but rather the way it was depicted became much more decorous. Scenes of vomiting or urinating are quite rare, and even these are turned into charming vignettes from daily life. The youth who has not yet learned how to hold his liquor, comforted by a lovely young hetaira who tenderly holds his head, or the jolly reveler returning home with his servant boy, who pauses to relieve himself, even as he declaims a bit of verse he has heard at the symposium. It would seem that the new democracy did not condone the outrageous behavior of the archaic komasts. Athenian men were now politically engaged citizens of a polis that considered itself to be a model for the rest of Greece, the school of Hellas, as Pericles would later put it, and they were expected to comport themselves accordingly. Perhaps the biggest shock, some komasts actually keep their clothes on. About the most daring feat we ever see is a komast balancing a full skiffos of wine in one hand a rank amateur compared to the amazing juggler of the Louvre kantharos. The institution of the symposium continued uninterrupted into the democracy, and if anything, may have taken on even greater importance for those aristocrats who saw their political influence on the wane, but who could still celebrate their identity in lavish gatherings, now captured on suitably lavish vases, like this one by Euphronius. The ratio of komast scenes to those of the symposium is now reversed. The symposium of Athenians, as opposed to gods or heroes, which was rare on vases before about 510, becomes a favorite subject of the best artists. The drunken komast declines in popularity, and when we do see it, it is rather tame in comparison to the roaring 20s, the 520s, that is, when Athens was ruled by a pair of tyrant brothers, and one of them would be murdered for being a sexual predator. As far as the Greek body is concerned, there is a radical change as well. Gone are the flabby, dissolute, middle-aged komasts of the klesophos in Akui. Even a balding older man now has the lithe body of a young athlete. No one is overweight. No one is handicapped. At the same time, something new is creeping into the komos, sex. The archaic komos, whether in Corinth, Athens, or elsewhere, consists exclusively of mature bearded men. No ladies are present. These men are almost asexual, since their genitalia are often barely visible. The long, floppy phallus of the defecator on the Louvre kantharos seems to be another comic touch, almost like the artificial phallus of comic actors. There is not even a hint of homoerotic playfulness, despite the pervasive nudity. The conventions of Greek pederasty dictated that grown men were never aroused by one another, only by adolescent boys. The komos of bearded men can still be found in late archaic red figure, but increasingly we see women joining in the fun, such as this one, whose availability is not in doubt. Could it be that she is a hetaira who had entertained at the symposium in more decorous fashion with her crotala or castanets, but is now tipsy herself and throwing caution and her clothing to the wind? The possibility of same-sex enjoyment is also suggested in komos scenes that mix bearded and beardless men, as you see here, though nothing is overt. So, in conclusion, what does this mean? We should suppose that in classical Athens, sex was in, but booze was out? Hardly. Neither one ever goes out of style. But the shapes and styles of men's bodies are another matter. It will be a good long while before the return of the unidealized male body in Greek art, perhaps not until Socrates at the beginning of the 4th century, and even later philosophers like Diogenes the Cynic. And now the discourse on the body and its relation to the soul has entered into a whole new dimension. Thank you very much.